Thank you, Catherine. It's good to see so many people here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Randy Bass, who is our keynote speaker to our ePortfolio at University of Waterloo Day. So I guess that's an official day name now for something we do here on campus. So welcome to University of Waterloo. We've been looking forward to your visit now for a while. Dr. Bass is the Vice Provost for Education, as well as a professor in English at Georgetown University. He's the author and editor of numerous books, articles, and electronic projects that look at teaching and learning. He's also led a number of multi-institutional initiatives and has had a long history of working at the intersection of technology and pedagogical scholarship. He is currently on the leadership team of the Connect to Learning ePortfolio project, which is a consortium of 24 U.S. campuses that are working actively together to promote the creative use of ePortfolios for learning, teaching, and student assessment. In recent years, ePortfolios have joined a growing family of technology-enabled learning strategies and structures that help deepen and personalize student learning. And higher education is rapidly changing, and ePortfolios in this setting can play a very large role. And that brings us to the title of Dr. Bass's presentation today, ePortfolios as Catalysts for Transformative Change, Reframing a Movement in a Rapidly Shifting Landscape. Dr. Bass.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So good morning. Thank you all very much for being here. And it's really great to see you, and I'm very happy to be able to finally be here and to have been working with Kathy to arrange this visit for a long time. I did slightly reframe my talk just a little bit. I'm not going to talk about ePortfolios. No, just kidding. The whole day was about it. You need to hear from me. But I slightly retitled my talk to Designing the University for 2030. Because in part what I want to do is to kind of talk about the future, think about the future, and think about the role that ePortfolios might play in us thinking about the future. Because I spend a lot of time thinking about the future in my job as Vice Provost for Education. And in fact, one of the things I spend most of my time on is a large initiative that we're running on campus called Designing the Futures of the University. So this is where I want to start, is just to think about the year 2030, which feels like it's a long time away, but that's only like 16 years from now. So 2030 actually feels much further in the future than 16 years feels ago. Right? When I teach with my students and I'll say something like, yeah, I mean, you just think back 20 years, that's not that long ago. And of course, they're all 19. So they're like, well, gee, I remember like I was in existence. But so let's just think back, like what is that far back that is far ahead? So this is a direct quote from 1994. And so I'm sorry for what my mother-in-law would call the blue language of this quotation, but this was said by the man who was the head of the largest funding agency in the Department of Education in the United States. This was Buddy Corrales, who was the head of FIPSE. And I always knew that my project, which was called the American Studies Crossroads Project, 1994, was the first web-based project that our Department of Education ever funded, right? But I didn't know until a month ago when the project officer for that project told me that when she was presenting my project for funding to the chair of FIPSE, that his first words out of his mouth was, "What the hell is the World Wide Web?" So that's just 20 years from what the hell to hashtag ePortfolio at Waterloo or whatever, right? Like that's like nothing to us. Like, you know, you want to tweet while that's 20 years. And if you think about the second 10 years of that 20 years, right? 2004, right? 2004 is like the IPO of Google, the founding of Facebook. YouTube isn't even existing until the next year in 2005. So just think about how much has happened even in the second 10 years of that 20 years. So you think forward to 2030, and that's only 16 years from now. So think about the pace of change. So one of the things that I like to think about is, and I've been teaching this class, the last 2 years, I've been co-teaching it with an architect called The Future of the University as a Design Problem. And so we have students who work in teams to design the university of 2033. And we ask them to design for context, not for content, right? To try to imagine what the context of 2030 is going to be like, and then to ask questions like these, right? What will the conditions of knowledge, technology, and learning and work be like in 2030, right? I mean, we could each, speculate about that. Think about that for a second. Just think about like at least one thing you think will be part of the context of 2030 that'll shape the work that you would do or that this university would do, right? How ubiquitous technology would be, how ubiquitous information would be, how embedded all the sensing technologies will be, how complex our global challenges might be, right? Where we'll be in the context of climate change, for example, where we'll be in the way that things in our environment are personalized to us. So whatever is your image of that context, what kind of person do we need to be producing to thrive in that context? So that's the question we ask in this class we teach. That's the question we're asking at our university. What kind of person? So not trying to problem solve for the next 2 or 3 years, but trying to think about that context, which is not that far away. So there's a lot of things to read and think about, a lot of people speculating about the future. One very interesting bunch of work from these two guys, Levy and Murnane, these MIT economists, asked basically the question, what in 15 or 20 years will be, what is it that humans can do that computers can't, and what is it that computers and robots can do that humans can't? And then asking, in 15 or 20 years, what work will be left to humans? Right? I know that may sound like an absurd question, and they say that. They say, this may sound absurd, but things we're asking now, would have sounded even absurd. So they say the human labor market will center on 3 kinds of work: solving unstructured problems, working with new information, carrying out non-routine manual tasks. Everything else will be mostly done by robots and microprocessors, and then there's other sort of low-end jobs also that will need to be done. But so what does it take to educate people to optimize for unstructured problems, working with new information, and carrying out non-routine manual tasks? Right? As well as they also talk about complex communication. Right? So simple communication is increasingly being done by computers for anybody who's had the actual, seamless experience of an online computerized helpline, right? But complex communications will still need humans. So how do we educate for that? So this is the question, and it seems to me we all have to ask if we work at a university, is what kind of education is needed at this moment in history? Like, why is it, what is more important than ever to educate for as we look toward the next 15 years? But then to me, the really interesting design problem, this is, when we take a design approach, and the reason I like to think about design approaches, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, we hear all kinds of things about disruption. The last few years in higher education has been all about the disruption of the university. But if you're talking about disruption, you're talking about how is it that despite what's happening around us, we can stay what we want to be? How can we preserve who we are despite what's going on around us? If you're asking a design question, you're asking, what is it we want to be? What kind of institution do we want to become? Right? So to me, the really interesting design question is, what kind of education will only be possible in these emerging conditions? The best of what we do now remixed with what it is that's now possible: personalization, community, etc. So looking to the future and designing for a future context is not the strength of universities when it comes to curriculum and pedagogy. I'll just assert that, right? I think universities in our research and scholarly questions are often very good about looking forward. But we tend to design our curriculum from the past through this moment. Right? So I think it's challenging to look ahead. So let me just set one part of this context. Then I want to talk a little bit about ePortfolios and some of the things we learned through the project that Mario mentioned that I've been a part of, and then kind of come back to this sort of big picture. And that'll take me about 2 hours and 50 minutes. So just to kind of set out the terrain and set your expectations. I'm just kidding. So this is one of my first assertions, that our understanding of learning is expanded at a rate that's far outpaced our conceptions of teaching. Right? That we have a far richer understanding of learning than the way we count teaching and the way we structure our universities is yet caught up to. So this is part what I mean by that. So we're now 15 or so years after the kind of naming of the learning paradigm, Barr and Tagg's famous article in the mid-90s, that we were making this massive shift from a instructional paradigm to a learning paradigm, right? Something, learning focused, outcomes driven, student centered, et cetera. So they said it would take decades for higher education to make this transition. And that's always a safe move. It's like, we might be wrong, but I'll be dead, so it won't matter. But we're 15 years into from when their article came out in 95, 20 years, I guess. So, so a lot of things have changed. We're not quite there. But that's really combined with this like huge expansion from research on learning and cognition of just what we even are starting to understand about kind of the skill set for the 21st century, that it's not just about knowledge, it's not just about skills, but it's also about dispositions, we might call, or a lot of people call dispositions, your ways of being, things like resilience, things like risk-taking, empathy. Anyway, I'll talk more about that. But so our sense of like what it really takes for durable learning, like that's hugely expanded. So I believe then that there's this kind of growing mismatch, not a complete mismatch because universities are great places, but this growing mismatch between these changing aspirations for learning and our structures. And that to me is one of the places where ePortfolios fit, is to help us start to bridge that mismatch. So this is a list that some may be familiar to you, but I don't know if Canadian universities use the NESI, but in the United States there's something called the National Survey of Student Engagement, thousands of institutions, so hundreds of thousands of students and millions of data points case. So this is their list, maybe it's totally familiar to you, of what they've identified as high impact practices. These are the practices at the NESI schools that have the highest correlation with student success, student retention, graduation rates, et cetera, and have the best correlation with sort of integrative learning and deep learning scales that are embedded in the NESI, right? So the first half of the list that's in black, those are what I would think of as courses that are kind of anomalous in the curriculum, but they're in the formal curriculum. And then these tend to be in what I would think of, and I take it you would think of as kind of the experiential co-curriculum. Okay? So I'm going to map these. So this is to me the map of the curriculum when I look out at my vast holdings as Vice Provost of Education. This is what the curriculum looks like to me, right? We have the formal undergraduate curriculum in the center, right? There's obvious graduate curriculum and stuff in there too, but the formal curriculum in the center, and then these rich experiential co-curricular things that are around, mostly on the margin. So we spend most of our educational money here. I'm not going to do that again because I walked right into the light and now I can't see you. But anyway, we spend most of our money in the center on the formal undergraduate curriculum, right? That's where we staff, that's where we tenure, et cetera. We actually, at least at Georgetown, tend to invest a lot of what I would call our mission and brand in the margins. Right? So if you go to the Georgetown website, there's a whole bunch of videos. I don't know who's watching these videos, but we make all these videos that we put up on the website. Do you guys have videos on your website like this? Right? So there's a great cartoon. It's a Venn diagram, and one of the circles says, things universities put on their homepage. And the other circle says, things people are looking for on the university homepage. And the only thing in the space of intersection of the two circles is the university's street address. So, anyway, so we have all these videos. Most of our videos are around this underfunded margin, right? So mission and brand out on the margin, dollars in here where we make very little distinction among kinds of experiences. So if I map these high impact practices, the high impact practices are either in the co-curriculum or anomalous, mostly one-off or two-off experiences in the formal curriculum. Okay? So one of the questions I started asking a few years ago was, well, if all the high-impact practices are either in the co-curriculum or anomalous in the formal curriculum, where are the low-impact practices? Right? So for a while I was giving a talk with the title, Low Impact Practices, formerly known as the Curriculum. But, so I never actually gave that talk at Georgetown, however. So, right. I'll give it as my valedictory address upon my retirement. But. So the important question isn't so much about those exact high impact practices as the question, what is it that makes a high impact practice high impact? Because in the end, it's not just about how do we get more and more people into first year seminars, it's what is it about those experiences that we could actually make the whole curriculum or more of the curriculum like that. So based on a whole bunch of different, looking at NESE and other things, this is a list that's kind of come out of that work. This is what makes them high impact, that they're the place where students invest time and effort. They're a place where, now here I'm borrowing a phrase from Lee Schulman, who was the former head of the Carnegie Foundation, one of his great phrases, where students have to engage in accountable talk or accountable thought, right? Where they're giving and getting feedback, important, both, right? Where they're making daily decisions, right? Or what we might say, making judgments in uncertainty, right? It's where they're having their perspectives challenged, they're being taken outside their comfort zone, they're taking risks in a pretty safe space, right? And it's the place where they have the opportunity to integrate, synthesize, and make meaning, right? These are the things that we think make a high impact practice high impact. So I ran a Center for Teaching and Learning for 13 years up until September when I was demoted to Vice Provost for Education. And you know, we spent all of our time trying to help faculty make their courses have more of these kinds of features. But this is a big map for me, and this is what I think of as like signaling the new ecology for learning. Right? So the new ecology for learning to me is sort of a big combination of thinking that these things are the things that make knowledge and skills deeply held and durable, right? And that it's traversing across formal and informal boundaries, including the way that we are living our lives increasingly in ubiquitous information and continuous learning, right? So that's the new ecology for learning. So I'm going to come back to this slide later, right? It turns out that those things are probably pretty good things to prepare people for that kind of work, right? So if you're preparing people for complex communication, learning how to function unstructured tasks, non-routine tasks, etc., working with new information, those kinds of skills and experiences probably are good preparation for that. So that's a phenomenon that I think of as disrupting ourselves, and wrote an article a couple years ago with that title, right? So even without the disruption of MOOCs and etc., which I'll get to in a little while, right? Even without that, we already have enough information about the highest impact practices on our campus that should be in a position to disrupt some of our core practices. In a token nod to student-centered learning, is there anything anybody wants to ask at this point? I have so much material to cover on student-centered learning that I really don't want to stop. But anything anybody wants to ask? Because I'm going to just kind of keep plowing through, but take just a couple questions. Yeah.
Your assertion that the curriculum is low-impact learning, you seem to be basing that on the student engagement surveys. Do you have any other evidence for that? That seems to me a weak argument for that assertion.
It's totally based on student self-perception. And I'm not saying that the formal curriculum is low impact. I'm saying that I think that that the core curriculum, the formal curriculum, is made up of low, medium, and high impact experiences. And it's not that the formal curriculum is also not an essential basis for experiential integration. It's that I don't think that we think of it from a design perspective that the formal curriculum is setting up these experientials, that we tend to focus on the formal curriculum as an end in itself. Any other questions? So I think every curriculum is filled with courses that are high impact courses. I just think we tend not to spend a lot of our energy trying to distinguish and look at what are the outcomes of different courses. We tend to just treat everything pretty much the same, except where we've made an extraordinary investment, like in small seminars. So the question is then, if we look to the future and think that, well, what we might want to do is have more experiences that are like high impact experiences, then the question that bears on ePortfolios is, what difference could ePortfolios make, or learning portfolios? You call them learning portfolios here, is that right? Oh, you do call them ePortfolios? Okay. To the future. So as I get there, just quote what William Gibson famously said about 10 years ago, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Okay? And to my thinking, in many ways, ePortfolio, especially the way that we've seen ePortfolio in the more sustained and mature initiatives, as we have seen it through the project I'm going to talk about, and very possibly here, because you've been at it for 10 years, that they're very much a bridge to the future. Right? They're very much a bridge to the future, and one of the reasons it's also often hard to get people who don't use ePortfolios to know what you're talking about. I've had many experience. I'm very thrilled to be here today to an entire event framed around ePortfolio, because I don't have to have the experience of just having people's eyes glaze over when I talk about ePortfolio. And I think that's part of the reason. So Trent Batson, who's very active in ePortfolios and other things, he made the really interesting observation that ePortfolio is rare among innovations in that they're not really replacing anything. Right? I mean, there really is no single thing that you could think of that ePortfolio is replacing, right? Technically, ePortfolio is replacing paper portfolios, but really not in the way that we're using them. And I think why that is working is because ePortfolios are helping institutions address priorities and meet challenges they didn't know they had 30 years ago. So that's part of why these are starting to take hold, even though there's nothing they're replacing. And I think that we can think of that in lots of ways, whether it's the new way that we're thinking about general education or a core curriculum as being not just about knowledge, but about skills and dispositions, or the way that we're valuing the connection between curriculum and core curriculum in new ways, or the kinds of pressures that we have on us around accountability and assessment. Right? These are just problems that universities didn't have 30 years ago. And ePortfolios kind of fit there. So let me kind of move through some of the findings from this project, and then I want to come back to this big picture. So the project was called Connect to Learning, and we've published a site. Let me just give you some facts. It was funded by FIPSI, the same What the Hell is the World Wide Web. People who brought you What the Hell is the World Wide Web brought you Connect to Learning 20 years later. Brett Einen from LaGuardia Community College, the director of this project, and here are the other folks who've been centrally involved. And I've been involved as a senior research scholar, but these other folks really, really drove this project. It involved 23 institutions from the United States of all kinds. About half were community colleges, state universities, and some research universities, Virginia Tech and Georgetown, et cetera. So pretty diverse group. And in January, we published a site called Catalyst for Learning. So if you look up Connect to Learning, Catalyst for Learning, ePortfolios on your very own Google machine, you'll find it. Very rich site. About 300 polished practices from these schools on different ePortfolio practices, but a number of framework essays and some data and findings. So we believe that the evidence out of this project supports 3 claims about ePortfolios. Okay? So 1, that they advance student learning and success. 2nd, that they make student learning visible in ways that help students become more reflective and more purposeful about their learning, and 3rd, that they can, in a mature form, catalyze institutional change. Okay? So those are the 3 claims. Let me just quickly move through some of the data on them. So here's claim number 1. Growing number of campuses with sustained ePortfolio initiatives, the practices correlate with higher levels of student success as measured by pass rates, GPA, retention, and graduation. So we have from about almost half of the schools in the project solid data that the with ePortfolios are producing higher indicators and measures of student success than without ePortfolios in various ways. So LaGuardia, pass rates, significantly higher. LaGuardia Community College, who has very mature ePortfolio practice, they found much higher pass rates at the integration of the students who are using ePortfolio, students who are not. Comparison courses. I'm just going to rifle through these stats and not give you time to actually analyze them. Rutgers Women's Leadership Program, about a third of a grade higher GPA among the pre-portfolio, post-portfolio use in the program. Obviously, other factors involved, all this very preliminary data, but this is some of the very first data anybody has on institutional impact of ePortfolio. So lots of brackets around it, but it's good preliminary data. San Francisco State, Metro Health Academy, extraordinarily diverse, challenging population to move through a program. They do a lot of things, but ePortfolios are at the center. Very significant improvements in retention rate and movement toward graduation rates. You can see very challenging context to get people out, so that's a significant moving of the needle. Tunxus Community College, interesting data that they actually showed better spring to fall retention depending on how many ePortfolio courses students have had and been exposed to, so kind of deepening and continuity. So one of the things that
Is there data, the data that you showed us, something like retention rate, it's kind of complicated a little bit, in that the ePortfolio also determines, there's a measure of, that is replacing some other measure. You see what I mean? That it could be also affecting how you earn grades in a course that doesn't have an ePortfolio. So are there any measures that are kind of comparing apples to apples?
Well, I guess it depends. I'm not really sure how you would define the apple in that particular way. If you're comparing to courses where students are just not using ePortfolios, and they are using ePortfolios in other courses, and you're comparing retention rates, what would make that more apple-y?
So if, from the technical side of things, so for example, there are standardized tests in physics on pre and post learning that show how students change their understanding of basic mechanics. Are there comparison studies that would compare groups that have gone through ePortfolio courses and groups that haven't on something like that?
I don't know of any studies. Nobody in ours was using, say, for example, a standardized test to compare those kinds of outcomes. Nobody it was doing that. But I also think that people would say that they're not necessarily using ePortfolio to deepen content knowledge or concept knowledge, that it's not necessarily being asserted that the ePortfolio is improving the performance on those standardized exams, that it's doing other things. It's helping students feel much more connected to their learning. It's helping them integrate the learning that's going on in the course to the larger sense of their educational purpose. So I think what you're saying, that would be really solid data, but you'd have to agree that the treatment of the ePortfolio was actually improving what you were hoping to be testing on those standardized exams. So like with high impact practices, then we want to ask the question, we're trying to figure out, well then, how is it that the ePortfolio is shaping learning? Like what is it that is, and this really speaks to your question, what is it that ePortfolio are doing? And we don't really know the answer to that fully. It's messy. It's messy to do work around these kinds of, so we're trying to be as systematic as possible. So all those caveats are there. But we did develop a core survey. Again, this is all student self-perception, a core survey throughout the project, and have a pretty good end, at least initially, to build a common data set where we actually worked with Nessie to add questions. And so students indicate, again, these are just students' indication of what they think their perception is, but that by and large, ePortfolios are helping them make connections, helping them think more deeply about course content, allowed me to be more aware of my growth as a learner, helped them synthesize ideas, et cetera, contributed to my knowledge and personal development, understanding of myself. So these tend to be all around that sense of like becoming those dispositional kinds of things. How are they allowing people to be more successful? Right? So a lot of the kinds of things that are on that list is what students are reporting are the impact of ePortfolio. Let me deepen that a little bit. So the second claim is that ePortfolio partially is effective because it makes student learning visible, and it makes it visible to themselves. It allows them to share their learning with their peers, and it makes it visible to faculty in ways that's very important, right? So when we talk about it making visible, we think of ePortfolio as being about reflection, about social pedagogy, and about deep learning, right? And that the social dimension of ePortfolio is very important to us throughout the project. So when we mean by social pedagogy, at least, is that students are getting feedback and getting lots of critique on their reflection. So they're not merely reflecting to themselves and not merely reflecting to the professor, but it's a matter of peer critique. Oftentimes it's for an external audience, and sometimes it's where you have integrated the reflective piece with working in a kind of community of practice, collaborating on shared projects, constructing sustained knowledge communities. But the social dimension we found is very important. And from the core survey, one of the questions we asked all of our students is, did you get frequent or medium or low feedback from your peers on your ePortfolio? And did you get frequent feedback from your professor? So did you feel like you were reflecting and building your portfolio in the context of a community or in the context of an audience? And we were quite stunned at the difference of how much people, like for example, this is just one data point, the number of students who answered those questions I showed you earlier, like ePortfolio helped me to make connections between ideas. The difference between when students felt like they were doing it in a social high feedback situation versus a low feedback situation was stunning. Is that clear? Then this idea of making student learning visible then turns out to be also really powerful for faculty and at the programmatic level, right? And we can unpack this, but this is the part that starts to lead us toward a kind of institutional change or programmatic change. The way that the more mature ePortfolio programs, it's not just being deployed as a pedagogy, but then in one form or another, there are occasions where faculty, stakeholders of various kinds, sit down and look at the portfolios and ask, what is this telling us about the quality of our students' learning? What is this telling us about the way that our program or my course fits into a larger ecology of learning? And it's that loop, that assessment loop, that turns out to be also very powerful. Part of this notion of making student learning visible, which in the most mature cases can lead to sort of, institutional change. And there's several interesting examples of that in the project. So that's just a quick tour of, and doesn't even really begin to do justice to the huge range of practices, et cetera, that are going on in the project. But since you're going to have some fabulous practices being presented to you as soon as I'm done, I didn't need to really spend time on that. So now I just want to kind of come back to my third here. Is that encouraging that I'm 2/3 of the way done, or is that really depressing? It's like if every talk had like a thing at the bottom, like a YouTube video, like you know exactly where I was. It's like, oh Jesus, really? That's really depressing. So, but you never know. Like I could end at any time, or not. So, is now to kind of so a quick tour of ePortfolios, which you all know about. You're going to spend time about, but now it's starting to back up into this big picture. So I talked about disrupting ourselves, right? There is, of course, the pressures all around us that are threatening to disrupt us. So here's my brief history of the last 3 years of higher education. Okay? It was only 2011, it was only fall of 2011 when Stanford University invented online learning. Right? That was just 2011. I'm joking, of course, right? Stanford thinks they invented online learning in 2011. Right? So that was fall 2011, right? When that happened, when that Sebastian Troon 160,000 enrollment artificial intelligence course happened. That was just 3 years ago, right? Then, this is how the last 3 years looks to me. For 15 minutes, MOOCs were cool. right? Right, massive online courses. They were like, you know, it's like everybody wanted to do a MOOC. Then for like 18 months, all universities went extinct, right? You'd read about it in the New York Times and Time Magazine, et cetera, right? You know, we all went belly up. All universities ceased to be relevant, right? Then MOOCs were not cool. Then MOOCs went extinct, and now everything is fine. Right? So that's the last 3 years of higher education, right? But we know, of course, that as you know, various people will put it, technologies are always overvalued in the short run and underestimated in the long run of what their impact on our culture will be, right? So this is the Gartner Group hype cycle, which even very early in the sort of MOOCs are cool cycle, people were saying, oh, if you follow the Gartner Group hype cycle, you'll realize that soon we're going to drop from the peak of inflated expectations into the trough of disillusionment, but that then over a sustained period of years, like over the next 5 to 10 years, then there's going to be this place where the innovations that were coming in that hyped period are going to start to have a really meaningful change on higher education. So when I'm looking ahead to 2030, it's starting to think about what happens at this curve to what we do. So these are all the, you know, what I think of as the forces of disruption, right? So the MOOCs and kind of for-profit sector, right, which is growing at a huge pace. In the United States, I don't know what the Canadian context is, a real drive to get very reductive measures of institutional productivity to rate universities based on very narrow metrics, right? Like just graduation rates, for example. And then the rise of data analytics and the role that learning analytics and data analytics and personalization engines and adaptive analytics are going to have on higher education. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second, but this is sort of my second assertion, which is the great tension that we're working through right now isn't between massive online learning and on-the-ground learning. It's not between digital and non-digital. It's between integration and disintegration. An integrative vision of education and a disintegrative vision of education. And this is a complicated tension, and I'm going to explain to you, or at least I think it's complicated, it may not seem complicated to you. This is why. So this was, well, I'll get to this in a second. Not that you can't read it while I'm talking. So in that period when MOOCs were cool, I went to a meeting that was pulled together by the White House and the Department of Education, 150 educators. There were tons of meetings like this where they had all these educators in the room listening to the heads of Coursera and edX and Udacity and Newton and Straighterline and all the startups telling all these startups with no business model telling higher education that your business model is failing. And at that meeting, which was called Innovation to Increase Productivity in Higher Education, okay, so they didn't even throw the word quality in there just to pander to us. And what we heard over and over again was things like, we want to look at learning down to the nano level, right? We want to be able to understand learning and to be able to make it adaptive down to the sub-concept level, right? Teaching should be a science, right? We should be engaging in these virtuous cycles of environments that produce data, data that produces reflection, and reflection that then improves environments. That's the virtuous cycle of improving learning, right? And in that conversation, the CEO of Newton, who makes one of the largest recommendation engines, says, I have 150,000 data points on your students you don't have, right? Which to me is like the slogan that is everything that is promising and annoying about the entire learning analytics movement. But I sat there listening to this discourse thinking, okay, I've spent like my whole professional career on technology and learning. Do I feel empowered or diminished by this conversation? Right? I mean, truly just trying to sort that through. And in part because what I was hearing, in addition to all the things that you might have been responding to negatively, was a higher education conversation about evidence of student learning and tight cycles of improvement for the purposes of quality of student learning that I'd never heard before and been trying to get people to have for 2 decades. So it isn't about it isn't a great tension being worked out between who cares about learning and who doesn't care about learning, or who cares about evidence-based improvement and who doesn't care about evidence-based improvement. It's about whether the vision of that quality of learning is a fundamentally integrative vision or a disintegrative vision. And so this is what I think of, sorry, skip that, as the split logic of the learning paradigm, right? That learning paradigm that started in the mid-90s, that's changing higher education. Both the integrative and disintegrative belong to the learning paradigm. This drive to create discrete experiences, outcomes-driven, competency-based, the for-profits, the recommendation engines, that's all part of the learning paradigm too. Designing whole learning experiences, thinking of competencies as part of a whole concept of learning, a whole concept of formation of the whole human being, right? That's also part of the learning paradigm. All of that could be in service of this, but right now, hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital are pouring into that space, and like hundreds of dollars are pouring into that space, right? All the money is going over there. All the Silicon Valley and Wall Street money in the United States is going over there. So it's really about an integrative vision. It's not about who cares about learning and who doesn't, because our ability to care about learning is becoming hugely empowered by that long slope up from the early failure of the MOOCs. So that's where I see that ePortfolios can kind of help us with this new ecology and how vital ePortfolios are to helping us navigate this future. So, and I want to just kind of come down the home stretch here with what I think of as the recentered curriculum. This is how I see this shift happening. So these are kind of my same circles that had the formal curriculum at the center and the co-curriculum around the margin. This is why I call it recentered. Okay? I think one of the things that did happen in the last 3 years is that the generic and interchangeable parts of our curricula were exposed as generic and interchangeable, right? Meaning that everybody's teaching intro to statistics, everybody's teaching principles of microeconomics. You may have a great one, it may be fine, etc. But that's what the whole MOOC movement was about, was that part of the formal curriculum is generic and interchangeable. And if you could create an experience that got as good of results in a non-local context, then a whole bunch of the curriculum could be commoditized, right? There's also a part of every university education curriculum that is irreducibly local. That's who you are and where you are, right? At Georgetown, we're Jesuit and Catholic. We're in Washington, D.C. We're residential. Other places are urban and diverse. You are who you are, irreducibly local. Where the most learning-intensive parts of the formal curriculum meet the most learning-intensive parts of that irreducible experiential localness, that is the sweet spot of the curriculum. And I think that we need to be designing for that center, that high-impact integrative center, right? Because that's where you form people. That's where you make people into professionals. Right? You don't train people to be nurses online. You don't train people to be teachers online. You train people to be professionals. You train people to be ethical. You train them to be reflective in that center. Right? Right? That's the locus of integrative learning. But at many of our schools, it may mean that we have to shift some of our investments to design for that high-impact center. But I think that that's going to have to be a purposeful shift. I think everyone will undergo that shift. Whether we're in control of that shift or not, I think is really going to happen institution by institution. So Kathy Yancey, who's written very interestingly about her learning portfolios, she talks about how portfolios live at the intersection of the 3 different curricula. There's the curricula that we think we're delivering. Then there's the curriculum as students experience it. And then there's the rest of the students' lives. And those 3 curricula constitute our students' worlds. That ePortfolios live at that intersection and give us an insight into where those 3 things come together. And I think that has a lot to do with trying to figure out how we design for that high-impact center. And I'll just suggest as I kind of close out, did you notice how many times I've tried to tell you I'm like about to end? I just realized that that's kind of like now become my new tick, so I'm sorry about that, but it's just to keep giving you hope. That at least 3 things to think about that bear on the kinds of things I've been talking about. Again, this isn't to say that knowledge isn't foundational and absolutely important here, and that people don't need knowledge, and that people don't need skills. Just talking about what is it that is the inverting in some ways our priorities for how we're designing for this environment. So I think it's the rise of focusing even more than ever on these developmental outcomes, on the dispositions, on the capacities to be creative, to be resilient, to take risks, to engage in critical empathy, to have openness to others, to be able to engage in acts of the imagination, to be humble, to be curious, a sense of moral responsibility. Right? All those are the developmental outcomes. To not just value them, everybody in this room obviously values them, every university values them, but to design for them. And you can't teach these, but you can cultivate them. So what does it mean to design an environment in which you're cultivating on purpose these kinds of capacities? So that's one thing that I think we have to keep in mind if we're going to design for that high impact center. And then the second is to value this notion of contributing to a knowledge community. Teaching students from the very earliest time to focus on unstructured problems or inquiry, engage in social pedagogies, be part of communities of practice. And then third, what others have called, and I'll just steal the term, self-authorship. That what we value is helping people create a kind of affirmative identity of themselves. On that idea of self-authorship, that's one of the things that we see at every level of people working at ePortfolios. Right? So this is a student at LaGuardia Community College, daughter of an immigrant family, as like 80% of LaGuardia Community Colleges. Right? Through my ePortfolio, I learned how to express myself as a hardworking student. Being a shy girl, always an issue. This ePortfolio helped me to see a new me, the potential I have as a student, what I want to accomplish in my life. Okay? Or at Georgetown, where one of the more interesting implementations of ePortfolio is in our master's program in communication, culture, and technology, where one of our faculty, Janine Turner, is preparing students to create portfolios so they can enter into the job market after the master's program at a pretty high level and realize they have no idea what their story is. Right? Realize that the process has to begin to get them first to go in. What is your story? How are you putting yourself together? Last example, a great article written by Gail Matthews-Natali, who's at Northeastern, who's part of Connect to Learning, wrote a great article called Are We Who We Think We Are? Tells a great story of people in their master's program in education sitting down and looking at this group of portfolios and being astonished at how, A, their notion of who their students were was like a decade old, and B, that their students were not articulating a sense of themselves anywhere where they wanted them to be. And she says it fostered an entire shift in our program from merely a program where we did what we did and bolted on the portfolios to rethinking the program from every stage where we were contributing. Students were building their portfolio at every stage, building a sense of professional identity, building a sense of an integrated self. And that was how their portfolios allowed them to see their program, to see learning whole in a way they hadn't seen it before. Each person just focusing on his or her own course in the most dedicated way. So in this Designing the Futures initiative, our president, Jack DeGioia, kicked it off with a talk. It's online, great talk, where he said universities do 3 things, 3 fundamental things, and we have to do them. And they're not just these 3 things, but we do them in an interlocking way. We form men and women, we produce knowledge, we serve the common good. And that it's not just that what universities do are those 3 things, it's that those 3 things are absolutely interlocked. Right? It matters the way we form men and women is that we do it in the company of people who have spent their lives trying to create knowledge or pursue a single line of inquiry. Or that how we pursue that knowledge creation is shaped by some version of our belief in the common good. And which in turn then shapes the kind of environment we create for forming men and women. Right? Other institutions in our culture do research, but they don't do research in that context. Other institutions form people, like the armed services, right? But we form people in a particular kind of context, right? Which, if you could easily draw a connection between those three interlocking things and the kind of ecology I've been talking about. So there's a saying about in the United States in the history of the 19th century that in the 19th century, the railroads that thought that they were in the railroad business largely went out of business. And the railroads that understood that they were in the transportation business survived. So the question, as we look forward to 2030, is, what business are we in? Are we in the 36 credit business? Are we in the 4-year bachelor's business? Are we in the content business? Are we in the skills business? Or are we in the integration business? Or the formation business? Or the transformation business? It seems pretty clear that if we think that we're only in the knowledge and skills business, then by 2030, we're going to have a lot of competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. I think we have time now for questions. Does anyone have questions that they would like to ask Randy? Any comments tonight?
That was fantastic, thank you. One of the things that you were talking about was this idea of making learning visible. And so what sort of things have you thought about or experienced around having us as instructors keep pace with that? So to get that feedback to students so that so it makes it fully integrative for them, sort of the faculty development side of it?
Well, and if I understand your question, I'll try to answer briefly in case I'm missing it. I think that there's two really important levels. One is the professional development level. So, faculty working to imagine, for example, how you can make use of new technologies that are very good at making student learning visible and incorporate them in a very organic way with your pedagogy, so that you're not adding to your work, but you're finding ways to retool the everyday work of your class in ways in which you have very small little micro cycles of being able to be visible about, and I could give you examples of those, but I think that there's ways, very organic ways to meld a kind of everyday pedagogy with the content unfolding of a course in ways in which you build those social pedagogies in to the very designs of the course, not bolt them on. And then I think there's no substitute for groups of faculty or stakeholders. It doesn't have to be just within a program. It could be faculty, student affairs, looking at examples of student work and engaging around it. It doesn't have to happen all the time. It doesn't have to be onerous, but it really there need to be these occasions in which you create mechanisms for integration, mechanisms for that kind of visibility. Is that what you meant, or did that not address it? I mean, I think ultimately it has to affect all of our pedagogies, and it takes a lot of work to do that. I don't want to undersell that. The whole craze around flipping the classroom as if all you have to do is put your lecture things online and then you suddenly turn the classroom into a high impact space, which first it's hugely labor intensive to put your stuff online, and then everybody says, what am I supposed to be doing with the time where I was lecturing? That makes it sound much simpler than it is. It really is about backing up to your goals, thinking about how you can shift the responsibility for making knowledge and working it through. But there's tons of great models out there, including using portfolios on the site.
Thank you. That was a really thoughtful talk. Thanks. Almost everything you talked about was inspiring and about ideas and teaching, and almost nothing was about technology. So this is my portfolio. It doesn't run out of batteries, and unless I lose it, it's not a problem. Why the E in ePortfolio? Why is that important?
Sometimes we talk about how in ePortfolios the technology is the least important, is the smallest percentage, but if it doesn't work, it makes everything else sort of fall apart. So the E in ePortfolio, I think there's several answers to that. One is that if the pedagogy at the heart of ePortfolios is fundamentally social, then the E is critical to that sociality, the ability to share, to see, to be able to share with multiple audiences, the ability to comment, to create a kind of reflective, aggregative, horizontal social space, very important. The E is also important in terms of turning and repurposing materials, so uploading, reflecting, making a space that is modular and manipulable. So ideally, a whole arc of a portfolio's life might be very learning focused in the development, but then there's a point at which a student may want to turn it outward as a presentational portfolio. So the E should, not all e-portfolio platforms do, the E should make it much more possible to just repurpose and resave and be able to curate your own artifacts so that you can create new presentations. And then the third way that the E can work, and some platforms emphasize this more than others, is with assessment. So there can be ways to use portfolios to assess or to use portfolios against rubrics, where the rubric scores by different outcomes are actually being recorded straight into the ePortfolio system. So there's actually an assessment engine on the back end that's helping to deliver out data across the portfolios. So those are all the things why E and not E. And that's why it really doesn't just replace a paper portfolio. I mean, you could do all those things in a gigantically unwieldy way. Part of the problem is they're really, a corollary to Trent's line that ePortfolios are the first innovation doesn't replace anything is, I don't think I've ever seen a technologically driven innovation in the last 20 years that's really taken off for which there was no good technology, right? I mean the iPhone took off because we just fell in love with the iPhone, even if we wished it did slightly different things. Nobody likes their ePortfolio platform. Maybe you do, but it's like learning management systems. It's not like there's a learning management system that other people have that your institution just doesn't, that's perfect, right? Even though we all like to believe that and tell our CIOs that. Part of the problem is that some are built to kind of optimize for assessment and some are built to optimize for presentation. None are really built to optimize for kind of learning and process and sociality, though a couple are trying. And Digication, the platform we use for Connect to Learning, he tried to put in a bunch of new social features because we were so emphasizing social. There's a company called Live Text who claims that they've got it. They've got the perfect portfolio. I haven't heard anybody who doesn't work for Live Text actually say that yet, though. But so part of it is finding a platform that is as fluid. The practices are way ahead of the platforms. Anyway, does that answer your question?
I think the practices have always been there. I did turn around in time to see what your portfolio was, but the best portfolio I've ever seen used across a program was 16 years ago, actually, at Indiana University in an undergraduate education program. So kids coming out of high school want to be teachers. Instead of giving them 4 years of classes, and in their third and fourth year they get into a classroom and are confronted with children, these students went into the classroom on the first day, and they spent 3 days a week in the classroom for 4 years. They took one methods course, one something other course, and everything else was a massive portfolio. They had 22 competencies that they understood extremely clearly, much more than their classmates taking classes, I'm quite sure. And they spent 4 years gathering evidence to put into their portfolio. Unwieldy, yes. We had a community of practice with them 3 hours a week where they brought their things in. We accomplished the sociality of it by having them come in and discuss their practice. They didn't look at each other's evidence maybe as thoroughly as you would online, but a number of great things about was that the extremely close link to competencies, which I don't know that we always accomplish in ePortfolios. ePortfolios or portfolios in general, we often say, well, just put up your best stuff, put up your stuff, put up. And it becomes more of a dumping ground than a clear reflective piece on why this demonstrates that I know how to X, Y, Z. And so to a large degree, as I said, I haven't seen anything better since than that They had a heck of a time finding folders that were big enough. They would pull them in on wheels. By year 4, I mean, they were hauling around these things, but they were gorgeous, blossoming, very, very unique. Another issue I have with ePortfolios is they really all do look the same. Some students have a better sense of what colors work than others. Some like Comic Sans font, and some don't. But really, they're all quite generic, whereas these paper portfolios, now granted this is a program-long thing, really spoke about the students. So I would love to get that, the association of the competencies I think is crucial, but also the individuality, bringing it in as well.
No question. All very well said. And yes, indeed, the huge sort of teacher education portfolios, absolutely very much like that. And to some extent, even out of architecture, et cetera, where all the best pieces are embedded in a history of crits and back and forth critique, and you have a whole narrative around the history of your ideas and your work, also would have that kind of thing. So clearly a precedent. And you're right, that's also one of the tensions that we see, is that tension between creating templates that help people get started and help people address competencies in different dimensions versus being able to have that kind of creative expression. And people throughout the project talk about that. But I think that's something that people will work out and the creativity will come back. But we kind of saw that back in the 90s when we used to have classes where people made their own websites. You know, I used to talk about there were 2 kinds of really bad websites that students would make. One was the Velvet Elvis website that had like all those purple colors and things, the purple and black. And the other, we used to joke about the ransom note website where like every other letter was a different font, or every sentence was in a different font. We used to call those the ransom note websites. But yeah.
Question about your research. You showed the results on student success measures as it compares non-ePortfolio and ePortfolio courses. What was your definition of an ePortfolio course?
A course in, well, and that might vary some in campus, but a course in which ePortfolios were considered a substantive part of the course, either by way of assessment or that assignments were being tuned to being contributed to a portfolio that was perhaps started not solely in that course, like part of a first-year experience, but the course itself was clearly oriented toward helping students make contributions to their ePortfolio.
Just trying to understand if there was anything that came out of your research from institutions where the use of an ePortfolio was made available to students as an optional tool, but not a requirement within a particular curriculum.
That certainly happens, but that would not have shown up in that data. In those particular places, they were places where they were instituting either at the whole course level or even at the program level.
If I could, indulge a second question related to your feedback data. What were sort of the definitions for low feedback versus high feedback on both the instructor and student? Was it volume of feedback, frequency, or?
Frequency. Like whether they were looked at once or twice, or whether you were getting feedback and it was formative, et cetera. I actually can't remember exactly how that was defined. That's a really good question. I should know the answer to that. But it wasn't, it wasn't exactly, I don't think we were asking simply on the quality of the feedback. It was really whether you were getting frequent feedback. Yeah, so it's a good question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
How does that scale, frequent feedback, in a class of even like 150?
I think the way it scales is that you find ways to teach students to give each other peer feedback, and you're very selective with your faculty feedback. So just the way that, you know, when I teach with a blog, for example, I don't have to respond to everybody's blog, but I will pick out blog posts and put them up and talk a great deal, especially early in the semester, about what makes a quality blog post and what makes good reasoning and things like that. And then you try to create criteria for people to evaluate each other. So it has to be peer and horizontal with very selective faculty feedback. But you have to make investments in, you have to invest in helping your students give quality peer feedback. Can't just expect that to happen.
At the outset, you talked a little bit about the labor market, and you highlighted the book, The New Division of Labor. I guess a two-part question would be, do we care what employers think about ePortfolios? And if we do, are ePortfolios credible in the eyes of employers?
I have yet I've been doing a bunch of focus groups with Georgetown alums and design labs with alums, and I was just recently doing focus groups with some sort of mid-career Georgetown alumni. And I cannot, and I've also asked this of our Career Center person, have not yet found any employers who say that what they're doing is sifting through ePortfolios in order to hire somebody. So, so I know that there have been some studies where people have brought employers in to look at what they would use, et cetera, but I mean, it may be that when it comes down to, you've really narrowed it down and you're kind of looking deeply at somebody, but that, you know, people are really like spending like 4 seconds. So there may be other data out there. I'm just saying me personally, and if you have contrary data. What I was going to say is that the power of the ePortfolio for the employer, I think, and I'll just frame this in the context of an anecdote. During one of these focus groups, I was asking these mid-level managers, do you ever look at ePortfolios? And they said no. Then we got onto another topic where they were saying, well, when I see like a Georgetown resume, I pull it out, you know, because I think, well, this is a quality person. I said, well, what if you have 10 Georgetown resumes and you only have one job? He said, well, then it's the person who can tell me the best story about themselves. The person who can tell me exactly, not just they did an internship here, but exactly how that internship helped make them the person that I want to hire. So for me, at the least, the most powerful thing about a portfolio is how it prepares you to present yourself, even if the employer isn't looking at it. So, but if someone knows of employers who actually are looking at it,
I just wanted to add a little piece, and it's an unpublished paper. Someone was looking at this in a small set in hotel tourism management focus, and they did just that. Entry level, not a chance. They're doing the stack of resumes, they're going through things. Increased promotion pieces, they were, oh, there's evidence here. Oh, this person created such and such for a restaurant. It was like a dietitian chart. That person got hired when that was pointed out to them. So there's an education piece on what employers know and don't know about these. But entry level has not been, and this is again in a small sample set that I found, but going further, people are starting to see them in this one particular case.
and in the course, the CCT course that I mentioned at Georgetown that Janine Turner teaches, part of what the students have to do is they have to go out and they have to have conversations with 5 people in fields that they would like to interview with to ask them what they would like to know about them if they were applying for a job. And that's part of what shapes their creation of the resume or the portfolio. Well, that was very clever of you.
Just something that we're discovering. I'm a visitor amongst the crowd. I'm not from Waterloo, so.
Making your double question all the more galling.
That's it. So the tool getting in the way of the process of portfolio that we've all discussed is the gold. How do you get over that notion? Because like you said, they're not all out there. Do you know any examples of multiple use of tools for an institution, or is everyone focusing on one? Good, bad, and ugly.
In some cases, it's any, and like again, at Georgetown, we haven't yet picked a platform. So some classes, again, like Janine Turner, she just tells the students, graduate students in communication culture, use whatever you want. Here's a list of them. Doesn't matter what platform you're using. This is about process, but it's a very particular context. Most places, I would say, have picked their platform. I would say of the 23 schools in C2L, I would say at least half of them switched platforms in just the 3 years that the project was taking place, causing tremendous trauma in that transition, but usually happier with the thing that they switched to. So, so it's a big deal, and so I don't know of anybody in C2L where it's just like letting 3 or 4 platforms bloom. But since many of the projects are program-based, it could be that some are using one and some are the other. But all the examples that are popping into my head right now, it's like that's a Sakai school, that's a Mahara school, that's a Digication school, that's a Live Tech school. So.
You seem to be a little disillusioned with analytics broadly, given the stage that it's at right now in the learning space, so very sort of narrow focus. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the intersection of ePortfolio technologies and analytics as it relates to some of the concepts you talked about around dispositions and the possibilities for leveraging things like semantic analysis of reflections to surface.
Yeah, no, and I'm absolutely excited about the potential of analytics. First of all, I think that some of the ways that learning analytics are being deployed, the context of like the Open Learning Initiative out of Carnegie Mellon, adaptive platforms, what's, we can demonstrate in terms of teaching and statistics and things like that in blended formats. That's some of the very best technology enhanced data that's out there. So it's only because there is simply the focus as if that's everything. And I think it's really, if we focus on what I call an integrative learning analytics, that's just feedback into a place where, if we could imagine contexts where portfolios and analytics coming out of LMSs and adaptive systems could be streamed, and think about how do they start to put together the portrait of a whole learner, or help us understand at a macro level what the whole arc of learning looks like across a career. I think I'm hugely invested in that, and actually just have started a new project called Formation by Design on my campus that I have some funding for, precisely to look about the relationship between full human formation and analytics, and how they could come together in integrative analytics. So totally there, and I think on dispositions, also potentially very powerful. It's just we're like at 0.5% of even understanding what it would look like to have analytics that would relate to disposition. So it's very important that the people who have the richest, most robust sense of that conversation are in control of that conversation, because the learning analytics people will want to reduce it and rationalize it as quickly as possible, and it's huge and messy and complex. So I totally agree with you. And I think that ePortfolio initiatives, one of the things we talk about inside the project is the next stage of Connect to Learning, is trying to model how ePortfolio initiatives could be the site on campuses that is that site of integration of multiple analytics. The most mature ePortfolio projects in the initiatives in the project already are doing that. They're looking at NESI data, they're working with their institutional research office to look at data, they're looking at other kinds of outcomes data. They're doing that integration, but not a single one of them is talking to the person in the IT organization who's just gaga over the learning analytics that can be chunked out of the learning management system. So trying to bring those two conversations together, I think, is really important.
Are there any other comments or questions?
I'm not actually a faculty member. I'm a librarian.
What kind of intimidating place is Waterloo that anybody who isn't actually part of the community has to out themselves before they even ask a question? My God, this is quite the place. I'm going to have to figure this out over the course of the day.
We're currently working with an DEI Stratford campus, and what we've done is we went there and said, what is information literacy? Give us a formal definition. Give us your practical definition. And come up with a method of transferring information literacy onto the next generation of students. What I see with the ePortfolios, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's an individual repository of information, what one student has done throughout time. Is that
would be the right. It's their artifacts of learning plus their reflection on how those artifacts fit together as a whole. That would be the simplest definition.
During the process with the MDI campus, we've got to come in and chat with the students at various points, and what they've done is divide the class into 5 different groups. One of the groups has decided to work on creating an institutional repository within a class. So what they're doing is taking articles that are being presented in a class 1 year, not actually creating it, but coming up with concepts, and having the students comment on it and making it available for multiple classes. So I kind of see it as the next step. So it's not as an individual, it's more institution and specifically the class level.
Absolutely, I think that's great. Yeah, no, I think that I agree, and I think that there's also huge advantages to that kind of thing also for kind of faculty development around new approaches, where you're actually constructing structures, information structures. We have a project at Georgetown where we're creating kind of virtual commons for a whole set of new history courses that are all a cohort of courses, but all teaching different topics, but all with the same set of learning goals around introduction to historical thinking, to create a virtual commons. But the idea, I won't go into it, but the only point I was going to make was that I think that's also a way that rather than taking a professional development approach, which is characterizes most centers for teaching and learning, that you try to change faculty so that they change their courses, to instead invest resources into creating structures and resources so that when faculty step in to teach a course, there's a kind of rich resource there that they can connect to that makes it a much lower bar of entry to do something innovative in their own pedagogy. So I think that's also something that's achieved by building these common shared repositories. So I love that.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit on that, I'm from that same campus, the Stratford campus, and so we have mandatory ePortfolios in all our project courses, which they're in the undergraduate 2 per year. So by the time they graduate, they will have a whole series of ePortfolios completed. And the idea, at least in my mind, and I have to say it's only an idea at this point because it's a new program and it's only 2 years into its existence, so we actually haven't graduated the cohort. But for me, there are 2 components. One is what you had mentioned, is that we can track student progress from year 2 to year 4 through these ePortfolios. So that's one component. But the other one that you had mentioned, and this is really what I wanted to ask you about, is that if you have considerable data from students over a considerable period of time, so let's say 3 years, you mentioned that you can also use that to do a curriculum review, essentially. So to see how the courses flow from year 2 to year 4, year 1 to year 4, whatever. And if you would like to make any adjustments. But we allow our students to use their own platform beyond year 2, so they can take what they, and most of them actually create their own ePortfolio because it's part of our teaching. So do you have any experience using ePortfolios over a period of time for curriculum review? And can you speak to that?
Well, I think a lot of a number of the programs in the project are doing that. In places like University of Delaware, for example, their entire ePortfolio, they only gave ePortfolio grants to programs who had to agree that if they got funding, they had to ramp up to where every student was using an ePortfolio by the end of 3 years, and so it became program-wide. Even not every faculty member had to be using them, but every student, they had to identify at least 3 different times in the program that would focus on ePortfolio. But they were able to then track program-wide views, for example. I think, so yes, that happens a lot. I think one of the ways, especially if everybody's using different platforms, one of the ways that people are experimenting that's kind of promising to norm that across diverse platforms is to use, if you've heard of the value rubrics, VALUE, right, the way you spell value, but it's all capitals, so it stands for something which I can't remember. But the American Association of Colleges and Universities, there might be something comparable, that has created a set of rubrics, or what they call meta rubrics, around a whole range of essential learning outcomes that go from skills to kind of integrative things and more dispositional things. And then people tune them to their own. But you could use rubrics where you would first develop a rubric where you'd be doing reads at different points in the program, and then you could be reading the portfolios against the rubric, and you could be using that as at least an important data point. You could be then using correlationally with GPA, or you can be, not GPA, but instructor grades and other kinds of things. But that would be a way to create one. If it was a community-tuned rubric, then you would be using more or less the same instrument at different points, even if the portfolios were all built in different platforms.
Any other questions? I think.
You guys have incredible staying power.
Yes. Well, thank you.
I'm very impressed.
Very, very much, Randy.
Sure.
This has been so.
Thank you.